start. So, thanks to HPU for inviting me to do this talk story, and I'm glad to see some students on. And just want to say a little bit about myself and about my career at HPU, and then talk a bit about my scholarship, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, and you can, I mean, at any point, you just raise your hand and you can ask a question. It's best to raise your hand first, though, because I think that it can get a little garbled if we all start talking at the same time. So, so I'm Jon Davidann, professor of history at HPU, and I've been there since 1997. That's a long time, and and so I've got a lot of experience. I know HPU really well, and so one of the great things about being at HPU is I've been able to teach a lot of interesting classes. And last fall I taught a class on economic crisis. This fall I'm going to be teaching a class on the history of oil. And oil, of course, all of a sudden has become this very important topic because the price plummeted from like almost $60 a barrel to less than $20 a barrel overnight. It's part of this terrible economic collapse that has happened. And so I feel like I've been really lucky, because some institutions, a professor goes there and they tell you what to teach, and you can only teach that. So I feel lucky that way. And there, okay, we're getting comments already. So thanks, Steve, for that. And the other thing about that is, folks, so, be sure to register for your classes next fall. Okay, that would help us out greatly if you register for classes. So I've also spent a lot of time doing research, and I've published 6 books. I'm working on book number 7. And really, for a small university like HPU to allow me the time to publish this many books is pretty cool too. So I feel very lucky in that regard that I've gotten support from the university to publish books. So my field is U.S.-Japanese relations, and I mostly publish in that field, but I also publish in world history. And some of you who are in my world history class will know that you're actually reading a book that I co-wrote. And I hope you like the book. My wife is reading the book now, so I hope you're enjoying it. So I've gotten all these opportunities, and so I was thinking, what am I going to say to students that might be kind of more than just my research, but that might be kind of compelling? And the thing is, when I graduated college, I didn't have really much idea what I wanted to do. I did know that I wanted to study history at some point, but I didn't really have an idea of, I want to do this job or that job. So I worked for 6 months at UPS, and I worked for another 6 months at Fuddruckers, which was a burger restaurant. Yeah, Antoine's expressing surprise there. Fuddruckers for 6 months, and really, I'll be honest with you, I hated both jobs. And it was a really hard time. The last stage of college and graduating from college can be a really difficult time in the young person's life, and it was in mine. And I didn't really know where I wanted to go, but I knew I loved history. When I was in the 4th grade, my mom gave me a book for Christmas. It was a pictorial history of the Civil War, and I want to show you. So this is not the same book, but this is still a pictorial history. It's called an Atlas of the Civil War, but it's got lots of pictures and maps in it. It's a really cool book. And I spent hours looking at that atlas and just pondering the tragedy of the Civil War, and just the amazing stuff that happened in the war. So I probably became a historian in the 4th grade. That's possible. And so I've got an unusual career trajectory in that way, because I actually kind of decided in the 4th grade. But I would say, look, one of the things that really stood me in good stead is I was really focused. And when I figured I did want to go to graduate school and do history, I really focused all of my energy on that, and I worked really hard at it. And I'll be honest with you, there was a lot of roadblocks, and I had to overcome those. And when doors opened, other doors closed, and other doors opened, and the doors that closed were disappointing. I mean, when I took this job out here at HPU, I'm from Minnesota, born and raised in Minnesota. That's my son beeping at us, and then so I got a job. So I thought, look, I hope to get a job offer in the Midwest because that's where all my family was at, and the job offer I got was out in the middle of the Pacific, and I was like, really, Hawaii? I didn't know a thing about Hawaii, and I made all kinds of assumptions, but 23 years later, it's worked out. So, part of it is just persisting. You might find that the most successful person is the last person standing for something, or literally standing. Everybody else has quit and gone home, and you're still standing there fighting for something. So I'd like to think that's useful. And then the other thing is, when I got the offer at HPU, I really wanted to stay in the Midwest. That's where all my family was. But I took the job because it was the door that opened. So you're going to find this in your careers. You're going to find doors closed and other doors open. And it might be that you just got to, cross your fingers and say, okay, I'm going to take it. I'm going to take that. I'm going to go for it. So those are just some things for you to think about as you approach your career. And, anyway, so let me talk a bit about my books. I published 6 books in my time at HPU. I'm working on number 7. My current project, number 7, is called The Dissenter's Guide to American History. I want to circle back and talk more about that later. It's really been a lot of fun to do this, and I really enjoy writing, so it's a good fit for me. The book that I just published recently is called The Limits of Westernization: American and East Asian Intellectuals Create Modernity 1860 to 1960. So it's kind of a long title. It's a complex, abstract topic. But essentially, what I had found in some of my other research was that we've overemphasized our influence on East Asia in the late 19th and into the 20th century. And I kind of went off of this assumption, which was kind of I suppose you'd call it a hypothesis at that point. And I pursued the research, and in the research I found actually that it was, I think I found enough evidence that it was actually true, that we were in fact overestimating our influence on East Asia. I don't know how many of you have been to East Asia, but raise your hand if you've been to East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, anywhere. So nobody has been to East Asia. Interesting. I bet Steve has been to East Asia, but I can't see him. So what I did is I went back and I did 3 things. First, I looked at East Asian intellectuals, and I wanted to find what the kind of their thinking was, what the roots of their thinking was about modernity, about this kind of the movement from a traditional society to a modern society and a modern nation. And whether or not they were saying, look, well, we should Westernize, we should definitely become just like the West. And what I found is that wasn't true. The intellectuals I studied Fukuzawa Kichi and Liang Qichao, and both of those intellectuals had traveled to the West. They knew a lot about the West. They were interested in the process of Westernization and adopting, some of the practices and the economy and the industrialization of the West. But they never said, well, I think we should be just like the West. In fact, Fukuzawa said, look, I don't think it's a good idea for us to try to emulate the West because we're so different from the West. And instead, they looked to some of their own traditions, and in particular, Neo-Confucianism. So to go any further with that, that's pretty complicated, and I'm not going to go any longer with that. But so then the second part of the book was looking at American intellectuals and seeing how they influenced East Asia by writing about East Asia, by traveling to East Asia. And so I looked at Charles Beard and John Dewey, famous intellectuals, and both of them traveled to East Asia. John Dewey went to China in 1919 and actually spent 2 years in China. He loved China. And then Charles Beard went to Japan in 1922 and spent about 6 months in Japan. And in both cases, the press, the media back in the United States said, "Oh, these guys had a big influence on. They're helping to shape modern Japan and modern China." But these intellectuals themselves admitted they probably would not have much influence. So it's interesting to see that they themselves understood the limits of Westernization. There it is. They understood this, but other Americans kind of refused to accept this. So that was interesting. So that they didn't have as much influence as we've assumed. And then the third part of the book is looking at the post-war period from the 1940s to the 1960s, and looking at this and trying to figure out how this what I call the paradigm of Westernization, the idea of Westernization, how did it gain such enormous strength in the post-war period? Because I think all of us, if we were to describe how influential the United States has been in the post-war period, we would say it's enormous influence, right? All over the world, but I think in some ways, especially in East Asia, because we occupied Japan. Our military occupied Japan for almost a decade. So that's where the idea of Westernization really took off, was in the post-war period. And it wasn't just the occupation. Certainly we were influential in Japan during the occupation, there's no doubt about it. I mean, we tried to change their language, their school system. We failed at that. We did rewrite their constitution. That was actually something we did do. And but there were a lot of things that stayed the same. Actually, the political leadership stayed the same from the pre-war and the war. Some of the wartime leaders actually became prime ministers in the post-war period. So there's a lot that stayed the same that we couldn't actually change about Japan. So part of it is this idea that other places westernized on the European or the American model is just kind of a fallacy in and of itself, because it's just other nations do their own thing, right? So, so I looked at this, and especially with a scholar named Edwin O. Reischauer. Now, Edwin O. Reischauer became a professor of Japanese studies at Harvard University in the late 1930s, and Reischauer began to write about Japan and the American influence over Japan in the immediate period after World War II, and you know, he was very clear about it. He made no bones that he thought the United States had actually modernized Japan. And he pushed it way back to the late 19th century and identified some things that I knew were wrong. And so that's how I wrote the last section of the book. I hate to say it, but I kind of attacked these scholars. They're both dead now, so maybe that's okay. But this is kind of what we do in history, is we attack each other's ideas. And that's what I did. I tried to debunk this notion that the United States, as a kind of monolith, modernized Japan. And of course, China is just the opposite, because China did not modernize on the Western model. They modernized on the communist model. And, you know, so that one kind of fell outside of what the United States, what the influence of the United States. So that's the limits of Westernization, and you know, if you're interested in that, you can get a sample of that on Amazon. That's an academic book, and it's kind of a complicated book, but actually I think I've written it in a way that's easy to read. I think any of you could pick it up and begin to read it. My mom is 85 years old, bless her soul. She just had her birthday a few days ago. She has a partner. My dad died about a decade ago. She has a partner who is 87, soon to be 88, and he read the book. He read this book, and I'm quite pleased about that. It's like, oh, that's cool. My mom has never read any of my books. She gets to like the first chapter, and then she says, well, it just makes me fall asleep. So it's quite happy that that her lover actually read the book. So anyway, so that's the last book. And one of the things I looked at in the last book is I looked at the way in which intellectuals, especially in East Asia, were emphasizing civic duty and civic responsibility. Now, you all, I'm sure you've heard of the term, and what does that mean? It means being responsible to your community, helping out when you're asked to, and being a good, in some sense, for the nation, being a good patriot. Not doing things that actually hurt the nation. And here's the thing: I think we've lost some of this in the United States. I'd say since the 1960s, but probably it started to erode immediately after World War II. And so this has become a real problem. That some scholars talk about this as the decline of the commons, the decline of a sense of what the common good is. And are we all just kind of isolated individuals, or are we a part of a greater whole that connects us and that we feel accountable and responsible for? So it doesn't have to be a nation. It can be a local community. It can be the world, the entire earth. So I became very interested in this because East Asian intellectuals were talking all the time about this. They wanted to imbue their populations with this idea of civic duty. And so I took this concept and I brought it into this new book that I'm working on, The Dissenter's Guide to American History. And what I did was I thought, well, okay, I could write a book about the decline of civic responsibility, right? Could do that. Hey, Cyril, welcome. But I thought, instead of writing something that's negative, why not write a book that showcases a history of civic duty and a history of kind of activity that has improved the nation? And so I hit upon the idea of writing a book about dissent, and I call it The Dissenter's Guide to American History. And so this is dissent as in D-I-S-S-E-N-T. And this is the kind where you go out and you hold up a sign in a march. That's dissent. You can also say, hey, the government is doing something wrong and needs to change. That's dissent. So I went back and I looked at dissent historically, and I found some great stories. So let me start with a story. Let me go back to the colonial period and start with a story. It's about a trial. The trial takes place in 1636. It's a long, long time ago. And it involves a guy named Roger Williams. And Roger Williams was a Puritan minister who had come to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1634, just like a couple years before. And ever since he came from England, he was well educated, very smart, and he was a classic dissenter. He liked to criticize things. And he came and he saw things that he didn't like about how the Massachusetts Bay Colony was operating, so he started to criticize. For one thing, he noted that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was taking land that didn't belong to them. They had actually taken land that Native American tribes claimed, and he said, "Yeah, you didn't pay for this land. You don't have title for this land," and so criticized them on that. And then he also said, "Look, what the Massachusetts Bay Colony did is they fused the church and the state. So they put the pastors essentially in charge of civil life as well as religious life." And Williams did not like this because he saw the realm of man as being highly corruptible. And he saw the realm of God as, pure and perfect. And so he wanted to separate those two. And instead, Massachusetts Bay Colony had put them together. And so he said, it's a terrible idea, criticize that. Finally, he gets hauled up in front of a civil court in Boston. And he's accused of heresy. This is a serious charge. You could actually get executed for this, but they didn't execute him. They convicted him, and he was forced to leave the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He went south of there with a few followers and founded what we know today as Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island. And he founded a town there called Providence, which today is Providence, Rhode Island. And in the town charter, this is really cool. In the town charter, the townspeople voted and passed a clause which said that the people of Providence have freedom of conscience. They can worship as they please. They can say what they want without the authorities getting involved. That led pretty much, well, not completely directly, but it led eventually to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, freedom of speech. And so, and also Williams wanted to build a place that was very tolerant. And so you had Jews were welcome in this colony where there's no way they were welcome in Massachusetts Bay Colony. People of other religions were welcome. Women were part of the members of the town and had the right to vote. In fact, 2 women did vote on the issue of freedom of conscience, and because they were the heads of households there. So Williams did some really cool things, and he's actually a great model of a dissenter because of the way he thought about diversity and he thought about freedom. So we're lucky we had Roger Williams, pardon me. He set up the history that came after in our constitutional framework. Now, Thomas Paine, let's shoot ahead to the Revolution. Here's another great dissenter, and what I would say, Williams was the first great dissenter in the New World. Thomas Paine is the first great radical, and he foments the American Revolution. Paine writes a pamphlet called Common Sense. And this pamphlet, it's short. It's like between 50 and 100 pages, depending on how big the pamphlet is. And Paine, so it's interesting. Paine came to the colonies in 1774, 1 year before the revolution began. And he came not to help the revolution, but he was actually fleeing arrest in England. So he had created trouble in England as well. He comes to the colonies, he gets in trouble in the colonies, quits his job, and then he decides, I'm going to write this diatribe against the king. And so he writes this 50-page condemnation of the British monarchy. And so it's the Common Sense has 2 parts. It's part condemnation of monarchies in general as a form of government. And then it's also part endorsement of republics as an experiment worth trying. And so Paine is, I think, he's another one to kind of, I wouldn't say he's a model necessarily. He goes on and he gets involved in the French Revolution and is very close to being executed by the guillotine, but escapes there as well. He is a pure troublemaker, but he really shapes the way we thought about the American Revolution as an anti-monarchical revolution. He's the first one to call the king out. Okay, so let me move. I'm just going to go through this very quickly, and you can ask questions in a few minutes here. So the 19th century and the abolitionist movement, this is a great example of American dissenters who changed American life. They helped to end slavery, quite frankly. And so 2 great dissenters, William Lloyd Garrison in the early to mid 19th century. Garrison is, I would say that he's like the second great American radical after Thomas Paine. He's also very strong, very opinionated. He's also what I would say is the first kind of anti-American radical. He's very critical of the American system. He believes that the Constitution was this compromise, which was a terrible, a tragic mistake, that the parts of the Constitution that allowed slavery to go forward. And he endorsed non-voting and disunion, which meant that he wanted the Union to actually force the South to secede. Yeah, Noah looks puzzled, and it's a kind of puzzling argument, and unless you inhabit the 1830s and 1840s and 50s, when William Lloyd Garrison had this tremendous following, especially in Boston, Massachusetts, in the towns outside of Boston. So, and the second American abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. Now, you've probably all heard of Douglass. Douglass, an escaped slave, eventually became an employee of William Lloyd Garrison's organization in Boston. So he kind of learned the abolitionist trade with William Lloyd Garrison. And so Douglass, now, first of all, for a while at least, he endorses Garrison's ideas and, disunion, non-voting. But he begins to think about it, it's like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. How are you going to change the situation of the slaves if you stand on the sidelines of American politics? if you actually endorse the secession of the South. If the South secedes, it'll become a slaveholding, slaveholding republic. It's not going to change the situation for the slaves. So Douglass came to this and eventually endorsed the Constitution as, with the right interpretation, is how he said it in a speech, that the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. And it is. When you look at the Constitution, there are some really great parts to it. The preamble to the Constitution, the "We the People" preamble, is really important. You should all, if you don't know it, you should all read that part of the Constitution. It's very short, but it talks about we the people, and it talks about us working together to, ensure justice and prosperity for the Union. So Douglass eventually splits, and he endorses political abolitionism. And the truth is, this is how slavery ends. Slavery is abolished first by Lincoln in the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but then the real end of slavery comes in 1865, and it's an act of Congress. Congress passes a law that eventually becomes an amendment to the Constitution, which outlaws slavery. And I think without Douglass, I'm not sure that Americans would have come to that choice. Douglass is another great example. So here's the takeaway from Douglass: get involved. Don't stand on the sidelines carping about the system. I know there's a lot to criticize about the American system, but honestly, get involved, and you can improve the system. It's never going to be perfect, but get involved and play a role instead of standing on the sidelines like William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, now the last two I want to talk about are civil rights protesters, and I don't think you've ever heard of them. Has anybody ever heard of Frank Kameny? Raise your hand if you've heard of Frank Kameny. No. See, no one's ever heard of this guy. And the second person is Pauli Murray. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Pauli Murray. No. See, so this part of what the book does is I try to raise up hidden dissenters and try to, showcase dissenters who really, in their own time period, were very important, but haven't gotten much attention by historians since then. So let's take Frank Kameny. Kameny was he was an astrophysicist who worked for the U.S. government. He was a conventional man in many ways. I mean, 9 to 5, suit and tie and everything. But he had a secret. He was also gay. And the government found out this secret, and they fired him, because in the 1950s, the government policy, this was government policy, that gay people could not work for the U.S. government. And so Kameny got fired, but then he got fired up. And he actually founded an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Mattachine Society. And this organization, under his leadership, became kind of the fighters, the real staunch activists for gay rights. And really, over the course of 3 decades, from the late 1950s through the late 1980s, Kameny was the premier gay rights activist. He organized so many things. So one of the things about Kameny, which I find really impressive, is when he organized a protest, he demanded that everybody dress properly, that they not start fights with the opposition, that they, if they were going to protest, they protest very respectfully. He understood that the gay rights movement was actually working under a kind of a disability already. He didn't want to double that by antagonizing people who were already kind of predisposed against him. So it's Frank Kameny's discipline, very impressive sense of discipline. Now, the other person, Pauli Murray, she's a young African-American female civil rights activist in the 1940s. She's in the 1940s, she's actually already doing cafeteria sit-ins and trying to desegregate restaurants in Washington, D.C. She's interesting because she writes an essay a few years later, once she becomes a lawyer, which is called Jane Crow. Now, you've probably heard of Jim Crow, which is the segregationist regime in the South, and that existed in this time period. Of course, under it, African Americans were second-class citizens; they couldn't vote. They couldn't use public facilities. They had to sit at the back of the bus. They lived in different parts of town. There were certain areas of town where they couldn't buy real estate. So Pauli Murray is protesting about this, but she also wants to go to law school. And this is like 1939, 1940. So she applies to Harvard Law School, and she's really smart. And so she has the qualifications to get into Harvard Law School and a few other very prestigious law schools. And what happens? She is denied admission, not on her qualifications, but because she's a woman. Females are not allowed to attend most law schools in this time period. She finally gets into Howard University Law School, which is, of course, an African-American university, and she goes to law school. She becomes a very famous person. She becomes an assistant attorney general of California. She helps found the National Organization of Women, along with Betty Friedan. She's really impressive, and so she keeps working throughout her life, but she understands that African-American females and females of color have a kind of there's double discrimination, especially in the American South, because they had the discrimination of segregation, and then they also had the discrimination of being female, which was, widespread in American society. So I cover this, and then the last chapter of the book is going to look at contemporary dissent and kind of try to make some connections between the past and the present. And I tried to do a little bit of that in the talk, but why don't I stop there? That's about 30 minutes, and we'll open up to questions. We hope to end by 3 o'clock. Why? Because I actually have another meeting at 3:15. So, all right. So, do you have questions, comments? You can you undo the mute button, Kayla? Yeah, so go ahead and undo your mute buttons, folks. No, you can undo your mute button. So do you have questions?
1 second.
Yep, got you. Yes, who wants to start?
Antoine raised his hand.
Oh, Antoine, go for it, yeah.
Howdy. My question was, you're talking about Garrison. Was it Garrison or was it Grayson? I think it was. Anyway, he was talking.
Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, Garrison and his whole view on that the South should secede. I was just wondering how that was supposed to work. Like, if you don't like the whole system of slavery, if anything, how is them seceding gonna work? Like, that would have meant territory completely gone from the United States. It would have become smaller, possibly weaker, and odds are then eventually the South would have become its own nation, and we would have been at odds with each other because we would have had a dissenter at our borders, or at least a lot closer to our borders.
No, it's a good question. Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the thing is, William Lloyd Garrison. So little more background on him. He grew up in the Baptist faith. His mother was a devout Baptist. She imbued to him this idea that that the morally correct answer is absolutely morally correct, and it doesn't really matter. Any other realities are superseded by this kind of morally correct answer. So he was a moralist, William Lloyd Garrison, even though he deserts the Christian religion. He decides, that the Christians are culpable in the slave system, which was quite true, actually. He was right about that. But so he's not a religious person, but he's a very morally kind of imbued person. And so, some of these other things you pointed out, he would dismiss and say, well, I don't care if we're weaker because of it. We are more morally pure because of it, and that's a better thing. And so, yeah, Cyril, so you've got it. So, Cyril, you want to say something about this? Go ahead.
No. I was just, no.
I mean,
just agreeing. Go ahead, man. Yeah.
That
Go
brings
ahead.
up
No.
another question. Like, how is... Okay. obviously slavery's bad, and he didn't think much of it. Also, it wasn't nice. But what's morally better, to sit on the sidelines and not do anything, or actually do something about it? That's
Well,
strange.
I mean, look, I mean, I'm in agreement, and it's part of why I've decided, it's part of why I'm writing the book, because it's like I just see such a discrepancy there. But one has to understand that William Lloyd Garrison had a tremendous following in the Northeast. There were a lot of people who, I'll get to know in a second. There were a lot of people who saw slavery as so deeply immoral that it was better to destroy the American system and rebuild it as a system without slavery than to tolerate slaveholding in the South. So I think that was their concept. They didn't think enough about the slaves, right? This is, to me, the biggest issue is, what about those slaves in the South? How are you going to help them by, allowing the South to go its own way? The other thing to keep in mind here, pardon me, is that Southerners were not interested at all in seceding from the Union in the 1830s and 40s when William Lloyd Garrison held this argument, because they were at the center of American institutions. I mean, that 2/3 of all the American presidents in the period before the Civil War were Southerners. Southerners dominated the Senate. They, not necessarily the House of Representatives, but they had a lot of political power, and things were going their way. And so they really had no interest in kind of fulfilling Garrison's wish of seceding. So you have this kind of natural opposition of Garrison to the centers of power, which were dominated by Southerners. And that kind of, I think that makes his position maybe a little more understandable, if still not, it's still kind of weird and not correct. Noah, go ahead.
Okay, this is kind of going to a little bit of a different topic here. That's why I wanted to kind of Antoine to, finish his question. But you mentioned the title was The Dissenter's Guide to American History. So it immediately made me think of one of the books that actually got me into studying history. And it was a book called The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. So a lot of Howard Zinn's point of view is very, how shall I put this, just very much, they say history is written by the winners, more history is written by the losers. What's your thoughts on authors like that, where they write sort of from a dissenter's point of view as well? So like authors like Zinn.
Right. Well, when I talk about this book on the street, then people say, hey, you're just like Howard Zinn. And I'm like, okay, I'm not just like Howard Zinn.
I'm not saying that at all.
But, of course not. But, because Howard Zinn, he worked at a different kind of university, and that book, The People's History, that was an enormous publishing success for decades. That was, that was the go-to book for dissenters, for kind of the liberal left in who were interested in American history. So I love it. I think Zinn was a great historian in that way. He had his limitations. Now, there's another book that I think of when I think of kind of the Howard Zinn approach, and I read it in grad school. It's called The People, Europeans and the People Without History, and it was written by Eric Wolf, and it's actually about world history, kind of trying to do the same thing with world history, focusing a lot on African history and other histories that had been underrepresented at that point. So I think it's a great approach to history. I mean, there's still room for this today. There's the academy especially on the East Coast, they're still much more oriented towards Europe and the United States than they are towards, Latin America and Africa and Central Asia. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of room to take that approach.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is just from going through HPU's history program up until now, I wouldn't say I agree with Zinn and his approach, but I won't say I disagree with it. I think, history, we should try and look for the center, not like he's very far to the left. You don't want to be, in my opinion, just really far to the left or far to the right when you're looking objectively.
Well, look, the thing is, right. So, okay, this
That's
is
what I like
about
what you
history and
about.
methodology. Right, right. This is a question about methodology and how historians do their work, and whether or not historians do objective history. And this is a really tendentious question that historians have debated for over a century. Yeah, I mean, there was a time actually in the late 19th century, especially coming from historians who were trained in Europe and especially in Germany. Germany really dominated the training of PhD historians in the late 19th century. And they had a professor there, Leopold von Ranke, who wrote the structure of history, and he believed that history had certain laws that you could intuit, you could pull out through objective, rational understanding, and that by doing so you could actually change the present. So there was this idea that by studying and recording history in the most accurate form and recording one thing after another, that you could actually you could create a new paradigms that in the present day would change the world. So there's that. And for instance, Charles Beard, who I talked about earlier, Beard was somebody who was trained in Europe, and he endorsed the von Ranke approach for a long time. He believed that his work as a historian and a political science at Columbia University and his other, I mean, he was a dissenter, so he was very active in he founded the new university in New York City. He was active in municipal reform, active in women's rights protests and movements in this time period. So Beard saw himself in a kind of von Ranke way, that through the recording of the past, you could actually change the present. Then he lost this in the late 1920s, and in the 30s, he abandoned this approach. So that's the debate. Is history objective? Is it scientific? Can we actually access the past in the same way that scientists create scientific theories? You know, for instance, the theory of viruses, like the coronavirus. Can historians access the past in that manner? I obviously fall on the side of saying no, they cannot. And there are probably other historians in our department who would disagree with me, but nonetheless, that's at least some context. Yeah. So essentially, my argument is, look, we bring our kind of predisposed perceptions. It's impossible to wean those out of history. We try to get as much distance as possible on the subject that we're studying, but we will never completely be able to do that. And so the Dissenter's Guide is, honestly, it's kind of advocacy. I'm not even trying to kind of do objective history in this way, and I'm trying to raise people's consciousness about this. There's some, this is acceptable for many historians. So it just depends on who you ask. Cyril, did you have a question?
I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, good.
No.
Cyril?
I was just no, not really. I was just going to comment on the idea of objective history. Yeah, and you said what I was going to say anyway. So, we all bring our own biases into it already. Like, for example, if we take slavery, when we say slavery, we think plantation slavery. But if we look at Rome, they had a different system entirely. And so, it's hard for us to even comprehend what that was like. And so that naturally will influence our studies.
Yeah, no, that's right. So there's, it's just, the objective history as objective fact argument has really kind of fallen on hard times. I don't think there are a lot of historians anymore who make that argument. Who else has a question? Desiree, do you have a question?
Not right now.
Okay. Carly, do you have a question?
No, not right now.
Okay, and Jaslyn, do you have a question? Okay. Well, so how are you guys doing anyhow? How's life in the coronavirus? How are you doing?